Mike, let's bring you in here more on that agreement. What do we know about how the U.S. and France actually brokered that deal, and what are the roles of those countries going forward?
Well, Stephen, U.S. officials had been working for months to try not to just to bring an end to this conflict, but to prevent it from escalating into a broader regional war. We're told by U.S. officials that a real breakthrough came, in fact, just days before the U.S. presidential election. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu summoned a top U.S. national security official, Amos Hochstein, to come to Jerusalem to tell him in person that he thought there was a window of opportunity to get to a deal. So we had several weeks of more intensive diplomacy involving Hochstein traveling throughout the region. President Biden placed a call directly to President Macron of France just on Friday as this deal was finally coming together. And these two countries do play an important role in enforcing this ceasefire now. What this deal does is take an existing mechanism that had been used to settle a similar conflict in 2006 involving UN peacekeeping forces and the Lebanese army, adds to it the U.S. and France, who would play a role essentially as a mediator if either side sees that there are violations to this ceasefire agreement. President Biden, during his remarks in the Rose Garden yesterday, insisting that there will be no U.S. troops, boots on the ground, but U.S. officials are saying that U.S. military personnel will be involved in a supporting role as needed as the situation unfolds.
Hala, NBC News has just released a new investigation called Zone of Destruction, and it actually talks about what awaits the displaced Lebanese people when they return home to southern Lebanon, as we saw on screen, that bumper-to-bumper traffic you mentioned. What can you tell us about that and what might await them?
Well, this NBC News investigation has revealed that 5,500, 5,600 or so structures in the zone that the IDF occupied in the south of Lebanon have been destroyed. In other words, about 40% of the buildings in the zone occupied by the IDF have been destroyed, and many, many more in parts of central Beirut, as we've been reporting over the last several weeks. Some very powerful bombs were dropped on densely populated areas in the Lebanese capital, taking down sometimes entire buildings. But in the south, well, all these people who are going back often will find their homes completely destroyed. Some of the residents have spoken to journalists on the ground, telling them that they don't even recognize their streets, can't really figure out even among the destruction where their homes are. So this is going to be a very painful homecoming for a lot of Lebanese people from the south, and it's going to certainly take a lot of time and a lot of money to rebuild, Steve.
Yeah, Zone of Destruction, that investigation really helps you see the scope of that destruction. It's online now if you'd like to find it. Mike, with the news about this ceasefire, can this tell us anything about whether the Biden administration might also secure a ceasefire and hostage return in Gaza? Is the president optimistic at all that he can get something done before his term is up?
Stephen, that is absolutely the hope of President Biden. Obviously, in his remaining 54 days in office, there is no higher diplomatic priority than seeing and hoping that this initial ceasefire with regard to Lebanon can be a stepping stone towards further progress as it relates to Gaza. We heard the president talking about the important diplomatic work that will take not just the U.S., but some of its key regional partners yesterday in the Rose Garden. Take a listen.
Just as the Lebanese people deserve a future of security and prosperity, so do the people of Gaza. They, too, deserve an end to the fighting and displacement. The people of Gaza have been through hell. Over the coming days, the United States will make another push with Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and others to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. With the hostages released,
now, there are two tracks, really, to the conversations that are happening going forward. One are obviously the direct conversations involving Israel and Hamas. But secondly, the U.S. is really counting on regional partners, including Egypt, including Jordan, the Qataris as well, to provide a plan to help rebuild Gaza once a ceasefire is potentially reached. Another important factor, of course, is the Trump administration coming into office. What role would they play? U.S. national security officials have been in touch with their Trump counterparts, as any potential agreement that would be reached in the coming months would ultimately have to be enforced by the incoming Trump administration.
And Hala, on that front, do we know inside Israel, does this ceasefire deal have any momentum or pressure that is being placed on the Israelis to get a ceasefire deal for Gaza, hopefully for that hostage return?
Well, we heard, as Mike mentioned, the president state that his hope is that this will give a ceasefire deal in Gaza momentum. But on the ground, that is not at all what we're seeing. In fact, the Israeli military is intensifying its bombing campaign. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, in his address to his nation, in which he outlined his reasons for accepting a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah, said that the war will not be over until Israel eliminates Hamas. And as many military experts have said in the past, eliminating Hamas in itself is a virtually impossible task, so that you will have some insurgent warfare taking place across the besieged strip. And so therefore, if Israel's stated goal is the elimination of Hamas, then it's difficult to see how a war or a ceasefire can be achieved in the less than 2 months that President Biden has left in office. But as you mentioned, Steve, the big question will be what happens when the Trump administration takes over. Will they push the Israeli prime minister to accept some sort of deal that will lead to a cessation of hostilities, so that President Trump, when he does take office, the future President Trump, will not have a war sort of ongoing just as he starts his new term in the White House?
A lot of changes on the way on that front as well. Hala and Mike, thanks so much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.